Honorable Ministers, Dr. Court, our Lovell, my old friends, colleagues, all the HR professionals and others. Let me first of all acknowledge my thanks for the Human Resource Professional Association of Antigua and Barbuda for inviting me to say a few words in 30 minutes on the whole question of productivity, so that the honorable ministers will have something to go and chew on. I know at least one has a PhD in economics, so it's easy for me since we worked together many moons ago on it. But certainly we hope that at the end of my presentation, which should be available, I'm quite sure Jeanette will have copies available to you, so you can bother her about it rather than bothering me about it. I want to, in the minutes I have, focus on 5 basic issues. I want to start, first of all, by explaining what productivity is all about, because sometimes we have a misconception of what productivity is and what is not. Look at the relevance of productivity growth, and I'm going to focus a lot on the growth of productivity more so than what I would call the level of productivity, because there will always be some productivity level around. The problem, as I would indicate later on, is this growth in productivity, and the reason why you have to focus on the growth aspect of it, not necessarily level, because we're all productive in some form of function. Then to move to how do we enhance productivity in both at the national level and our organizational level. And then it's always good to give some Caribbean evidence, because people say, well, Downsy talking a lot of old talk and nice thing, but do these things work? And I've been involved over the past couple of years in looking at the effects of various productivity initiatives in both at the organizational level and the national level. And I want to give you some evidence, if I have the time. I won't go through all the evidence, but the handout will give you much more than I would be able to say. And then I want to say something about beyond productivity. It sounds odd that I'm giving a talk on productivity and practical aspects of productivity and talking beyond productivity. But I say so because, as Gail had indicated, I used to be chairman of the National Productivity Council, which was established very much for the same reasons that you're going through. That there was a crisis in Barbados in the 1990s, and we moved to establish the Productivity Council, and I was asked to chair that one. And by the end of my first term, because I didn't renew my thing, we had moved beyond the concept of productivity into what we now call performance. Even the Singapore National Productivity Council, as it was then, focused more on that one, and they were moving way ahead into areas of performance more so than productivity. So I want to end off by saying that while the talk is about productivity specifically, and probably very narrowly productivity, we want to certainly go beyond that. So let's move to the concept of productivity. And I hope you can read that, and as I said, you have a little set of lights there to shine that are not shining, but we'll see. And I define it as the extent to which an organization or a country, it doesn't necessarily have to be an organization, but organization broadly, is able to produce a range of goods and services of a particular quality, because you don't just want to produce garbage, using a range of resources, whether those resources are raw materials, whether they're machinery and equipment, whether they're human resources, and so forth. So productivity involves 2 elements. Anytime you talk productivity, you're talking about an output and an input together. People always say, well, it is not only the output. If you have output, you must automatically have an input. But it's the relationship between the two that we talk about productivity. You want to necessarily increase the amount of output relative to the amount of inputs being used, or for a given level of output, you want to reduce the amount of inputs that you're going to use. So anytime we're talking productivity, we are saying you're talking about both the output side and the input side together. So in that case, that's what we're talking about. And I introduced, unfortunately, an economic concept of real value, because in economic terms, we always talk about money and value of things. And since you cannot add chairs and desks and cups together and call them something, we have to convert all of those to some monetary unit. But really and truly, you're interested in the number of chairs, the number of cups, and the number of tables that you put together. So you have to find a way of putting that together. And economists use the concept of real value for doing that. So that's just a technical side. But the main carry-away point here is that when we talk about productivity, we're talking about the amount of output relative to the amount of input that we're using. So when you leave here, distributes itself with any other concept other than that. And it will come in some form or fashion or as you define the thing going through. So as I said, it's usually a ratio of the amount of goods you produce relative to the inputs. And we have different ways in which we can, in practice, measure productivity. Probably the most commonly used measures of productivity tend to be what we call the partial measures of productivity. To produce a particular good, it involves not only human capital, human resources, but it includes machinery and so forth. To produce this meal that you just had, for example, you had to use stoves, but you had to use cooks and other types of people. So the productivity would certainly involve all of those elements. So if you want to look certainly at just the productivity of the cook alone, or the chef, therefore we're talking about that as a partial productivity measure. But when you want to consider all the inputs that are involved in the production of the meals today, therefore you're talking about the total productivity, involving all the inputs, involve the energy, the electricity, the machinery, the stoves, and also the persons who have to work on that. That's basically what you want to pull together in terms of total productivity. So, but there are always challenges associated with measuring total productivity, and you'll find that a lot more emphasis tends to be on the partial productivity measure than the total productivity measure. And in many cases, therefore, when we look at the practical aspects of productivity, we tend to look at a family of partial measures. So where you can have the information. So it might be easier, therefore, to say I can get energy costs, or the amount of energy used, electricity and so forth, or I can get the amount of people, labor being used. And I can use those two measures and combine those as a family, so to speak. But it means that there might be other elements that went into the production of the meal other than just those two. But the family is basically what we have. You're saying, therefore, your probably family might very well be the husband or wife and the big son, but the baby you might ignore because he can't talk or she can't talk yet. So you want to focus on the talkers. So therefore, when we are talking about productivity then, we are, in many respects, this is why I said about level. If I had a firm that was producing the real value of 100,000 units of some sort of output, and the amount of labor used was, let's say, 1,500 person hours, I didn't use man hours here to make sure I'm not generalized, then the level of productivity, and this is the key word here, the level of productivity is given by that particular figure. Now, what this says is, therefore, for every output that you produce, there must be an input. I don't think you can produce anything without putting something in. No matter, if you can think of something you can produce without putting something in, but let me know. But certainly that is what we're doing. So you always have a level of productivity in place. So as we move ahead, this is now the starting point, the level of productivity. And what we want to do is, as I will see later on, is moving forward to be able to see how we increase that level of productivity. How either we increase the amount of output that we can get from the existing resources that we're using, or alternatively we want to minimize the amount of resources we're using for the same level of output. Another way in which we can look at productivity, another definition but involving the same ideas, is the idea that you can define productivity as the ability of an organization to achieve its goals, whatever those goals are. And in many cases, when you come, they say, to a non-profit organization, it may not be output as a thing, but some goals, at the minimum, utilizing the minimum resources available. So that's another way of putting it. And this now brings us to the realm of what we call efficiency and effectiveness. And one way in which you can define productivity in utilizing this idea is that we can have the effectiveness focusing a lot on the goal achievement, achieving that goal, and the efficiency having to do with the utilization of resources. So that when we divide it to where, as I said, effectiveness has to do with the degree to which you can achieve a particular goal or objective. So you can put it to be an output achievement, whatever that output is, right? And the efficiency might very well be how much resources you want to use. So you might have a goal saying, I want to get married by 20 or 25. That's your goal. That's the output. The question is, will you be able to reach that goal before you reach 20 or 25 is the case? That's the efficiency. You might find your goal, you might get married at 30 years old. Therefore, you weren't very efficient in finding a husband. That's basically what it boils down to. So, or wife, sorry. I have to be careful with the gender thing here. So you achieved the objective, but it took you a longer time than you think. So you weren't very productive in your endeavor. Now, why I focus on this aspect of productivity, it lends us naturally into the realm of performance. And in a sense, therefore, in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, which are two essential performance measures, we are able now to talk about, in organizations, a very topical, as I said, beyond productivity, into the whole question of performance. And many organizations are now utilizing the idea of key performance indicators. I'll come back to this idea of key performance indicators when I mention what we call now the balanced scorecard idea and performance-based payment schemes later on. So basically, therefore, when we talk about productivity, to summarize, we are talking either about the relationship between output to input in an organization, or alternatively, the relationship between effectiveness and efficiency in how we do things in the organization. And therefore, we can have several measures of how we can use, how we can assess the level of productivity and later on the growth in that particular product. Because we can't talk about productivity growth unless we've established the level of productivity growth to go forward, okay, or base level. So in practice then, what we have is a number of partial measures of productivity with a lot of implicit assumptions, because we tend to utilize various measures out there. But in many cases, if you're going to be very careful when you're talking about this, the hidden assumptions behind some of these things. And most cases of productivity measures, the hidden assumptions tend to be in the price changes. Because remember I said, you're interested in the amount of things, the physical things that you're actually doing, the real things that you're doing, not necessarily the inflated ones. So you have to get rid, in many cases, in terms of the original definition, those price changes. So in practice, you find a number of organizations, and many that I've worked with, have used things like revenue or sales to wages or labor costs as a measure of productivity, right? Because the revenue or sales relate to the output, and the wages or labor costs relates to the labor input. But remember, in labor costs and wages, there's not only the wage bill incorporates not only the wages itself, the wage rate itself, but the number of people that are working. So you have to therefore hold back on the wage rate itself and focus more on the amount of people and the man hours that they involve. Similarly, variability to number of persons employed. Output, if you're looking at energy, you might have an electricity company, for example, the output of electricity relative to the amount of energy you use. Sales, the number of persons or the number of wages. Output to man. So these are a range of possible measures I've had. And what I've done, I've asked Jeanette to circulate, and you can get copies of it, a list of various measures that have been used in both the public sector and the private sector. Because there are people in the public sector who feel that productivity can't be measured. And that should be disabused. I spent about 3 to 4 months at the federal government in the United States when I was chairman of the Productivity Council, looking at their federal productivity program. And one of the handouts actually give you some of the measures that were actually used by the federal government in their productivity system. So you have that available, and Ms. Charles will be the person. Again, if you want to look at total productivity, as I said, you can look at revenue versus total cost, because the total cost will incorporate all of those inputs that you essentially use, and the revenue will certainly be the output that you would have done. Right, so that's what productivity is all about. One, it is the output relative to input, effectiveness versus efficiency, and what we have is different measures of it, either a partial measure or a total measure of productivity. As I said earlier, the question that arises is that not necessarily the level of productivity, fine, that's static. But what we're more interested in as policymakers, as economists, as the human resource practitioners and so forth, is how do we get the productivity levels up? How do we move them up in many respects? And I want to say here in relation to how the relevance of productivity growth to an Antigua and Barbudan economy, for example. And I know both ministers will be key to hear this. Now, enhancing productivity at all levels of the economy, whether it's a department, organization, or set in the nation, is vital to economic growth, is vital to enhancing your standard of living, is into international competitiveness, inflation control, employment generation. These are key important things that certainly we are all interested in. That is, improving the overall welfare of Antigua and Barbuda requires us to enhance our productivity. And the question is, why and how come? So, for example, let me take the case of a firm. Firms are established, a private enterprise is set up to be profitable. Profit is the bottom line, as they say. But to be profitable, profitability depends on two elements. Your ability to recover costs, what we call price recovery. That is, you buy goods, inputs, and therefore you want to make sure that you can charge output a price to recover those inputs. But it also depends on the productivity of the resources that you bought. That's basic. all the profitability of all enterprises, bar none, depend on the ability to recover costs or price recovery and or productivity. And the choice is yours. In a highly competitive environment where you can't change prices as you would like because there's a competitor around there who's going to undercut you, where can you go? You can turn nowhere else but productivity. Long and short. And I can demonstrate it mathematically if you want me to. If anybody want to charge, no problem, you can do that. But this is not the talk for that. So the reliance must be placed on increasing productivity and certainly enhancing the quality. So if you are a service operation, quality of service becomes important. So if you come in here and you got bad service from the hotel institute, well, you want to come back again. Productivity levels will decline because they will not be producing the output for the staff that they have. So again, at the macro level, international competitiveness, and this is what for the Minister of Economy, is critical. Now, why this is important is that Barbados, like the OECS or the ECCU, have a fixed exchange rate system. The Eastern Caribbean cannot change its exchange rate unless all countries agree. Unless that has changed, Harold. It hasn't changed, it's still very much so. And that is you see how strict that is. So all adjustment has occurred around that particular fixed exchange rate. Barbados has the same thing. They say that the day that the governor of Barbados changes the exchange rate, that's the day the government goes through the window. So we don't even talk about it. When the IMF visits us, well, we say, well, the IMF, the exchange rate is far out in the sea, and you can't get at it. Let us talk about all the other factors here. Now, in terms, an important element of the whole question of price competitiveness, although you can't change the exchange rate, the important element is a measure of competitiveness is what we call the real unit labor cost. And that real unit labor cost is simply defined as the real wages that you pay. That is, you have a situation where a guy gets how much was the person per wages, so to speak, how much a person can buy in goods and services relative to the labor productivity of that person. So it says, therefore, if your real unit labor cost is lower than another country's real unit labor cost for the same good, you certainly will be able to outcompete in the international market. So how can you get your real unit labor cost down? Either you're going to have to keep your real wages down, or you're going to increase your productivity. Now, what we did in Barbados, we can do very much about prices, but when we went through our crisis, we cut wages and set up a productivity council. So we were working on both. But it went something that could work against you because you have people in the streets and so forth. I'm not advocating to ministers you should do that, cut wages. I mean, we have learned that's the hard way out. And I got a whisper that might be considered, but that's only a whisper. But certainly the point I want to emphasize for this exercise is that in terms of international competitiveness, whereas tourism, especially you have other things you're exporting, that again, productivity is critical going forward. So therefore what we want to say is that with increased productivity, companies will benefit. Increased sales, competitiveness, employees will benefit by virtue of better wages, bonus payments and so forth. Customers will benefit from lower prices, and the society in general will benefit because certainly with increased productivity, governments will have an expansion in growth and output in the economy, and therefore more revenue that therefore will be used for infrastructural development. So how important is this for Antigua and Barbuda? Now, what I have observed is that, and interesting, I should say that just on Monday, I delivered a presentation in Barbados on accelerating economic growth in the Barbadian economy. And I've seen the same picture that I will show you here in Antigua. There's a declining trend in economic growth since the 1960s in the region, and it seems to be for all the countries in the region. The heyday of economic growth when we were talking about 5 and 6%, long gone. We're now talking about 2 and 3. In fact, if we get 2.5%, 3%, we're very good. That's excellent growth. Even the IMF now is talking about 2 and 3 in the world economy. So what we have is a declining trend in economic growth. And one way in which you can enhance your economic growth is by enhancing your productivity, well established. You have high volatility in economic activity. You have a recession in the economy here since 2009, and that's affecting. I think yours is seen to be a little more severe than probably others that I've seen, which is, I'll talk to you about that later on, because when I look at the figures, it's almost 20% in 2 years, and that is significant. So something to work about. There's a declining ratio of exports of goods and services to GDP. Now that's worrisome because that's saying something about your competitiveness internationally. It moved from 89% to 59% to 4%. And for a small open economy like Antigua, that is problematic. So you have to therefore, in order to enhance your productivity, you need to work on that. You have a high dependence on the services sector, particularly tourism. And of course, you have a standby 36 months, I think, that's still in place, that hasn't changed it, agreement. And in that agreement, you have two important elements that are relevant here. One, the focus, and the IMF has stated very clearly, you need to focus on enhancing productivity and improving competitiveness in the Antigua and Barbuda economy. So you can see, therefore, productivity enhancement, productivity growth is critical to economic growth in the Antigua and Barbuda economy, and also enhance to the issues of competitiveness. Now that is a picture I want to show you. What you're seeing here is an economy that, and this straight line is a linear trend. A trend is either upwards or downwards. So we're seeing here, therefore, a lot of volatility in the Antigua and Barbuda economy over the past, since 1977. And a declining trend. Now that declining trend is worrisome. If I were Minister of Economy, Economic Affairs, or what have you, I would be worried about that. And basically, that's what I've seen in Barbados. Barbados has experienced the same thing. And what we are now talking about is how can we focus not only on accelerating, but we have to bring it back up. It's almost like an airplane landing and then coming back up. It's now on the tarmac, and it needs to we need to get it off the ground and moving again. So here, therefore, is what the challenge you have to deal with in relation to Antigua and Barbuda, and it's the same challenge that exists in other countries in the region. So how can we go about enhancing productivity? And in many respects, there's an organizational focus, what we call a microeconomic focus, but there's also a macro focus. That is, the government has to deal with some issues, the infrastructure, whether it's telecommunications, or whether it's the roads and so forth. That element has to be done, and I'll show you some evidence in Jamaica where that is so. But also, a lot takes place within organizations themselves, because certainly it is the organizations that produce the bulk of the output. For most of the Caribbean countries, something like 70, 80% of production takes place in the private sector. Government is a very small, and even that thing you call production in government is really wages and salaries in terms of how it's calculated to a large extent. But the production takes place in the private sector, and therefore the focus then of increasing productivity has to be how do we get the private sector organizations to increase and enhance the productivity. So my focus is particularly on that. Now there are two basic, and therefore the several techniques that exist there, and we call it the whole question of productivity management process. How do we enhance it? It's part of that broader aspect of productivity. And there are two broad groups of tools or techniques that can be used. And there's the sort of industrial engineering economic techniques, set of economic techniques, which economists and industrial engineers tend to focus on. And there's the ones that most of you here, the sort of human, what we call, for the want of a better word, the soft side things, which are important, techniques that are there. But both must go hand in hand, as I will indicate to you later on. So what are some of the industrial engineering techniques? There are things like just-in-time production, business process re-engineering, computer system design and engineering, the balance scorecard, which is again the economist aspect, and the balance scorecard is now, and I should pause here because the university has now adopted, the University of West Indies has now adopted the balance scorecard as an important element of its strategic planning, which I'm actually leading the process. So I know much more about that than other things. So the balance scorecard is being used from an economic perspective. And also you have activity-based costing, benchmarking, and Six Sigma as being some of those industrial engineering techniques that have been used. Now, in terms of the human and behavioral techniques, you have total quality management, you have human resource management, various range of human resource management skills and techniques. We have gain sharing schemes, and let me pause on the gain sharing schemes for a moment. One of the interesting things that I found, certainly when I took up the job as chairman of Productivity Council, was that the gain change schemes, especially the scanning scheme, developed out of recession, believe it or not. Here it is, you had a situation where the economy was in decline, companies were having severe losses. And the question is, how do we get out of this? And basically what happened is that they realized that what you have to do is be able to share gains, that is, they might still be in a loss position, but their gains by minimizing the losses. And if you can reduce losses, you can share the gains of that minimization with the workers. So although you can give workers something although things are bad, because that's something they've been able to make things less bad, if you want to put it that way, going forward. So gain change schemes are very popular in a recessionary period. In fact, it is part of what we call in the literature the shared economy. That is, the shared economy is one in which we use various techniques, macroeconomic and also microeconomic techniques, which allows you to overcome the problems of stagflation. That is a situation where the economy is in decline and you have inflation at the same time. Gain change schemes is one element of that shared economy aspect, and something that is almost the first in terms of protocol, the first thing you want to do in a company. There are different generations of gain change schemes. You have the first generation, which was Cannon and Rucker. Then you have the input share, which is the second generation, and now we enter third generation and fourth generation goal sharing schemes, which are akin very much to a performance-based payment schemes, so to speak. So then we have these other human and behavioral techniques such as organization development, strategic planning, customer relations management, and so forth. So what these particular tools and techniques will tell us that in enhancing productivity and performance in an organization, there are a number of things you need to look at and look for. First of all, that there must be a continuous improvement of your business processes. You have to always check these things. What we have is a poor habit in the region, that when things are bad, we can deal with them then. We need a crisis. We have a crisis, and we need something now. When that crisis is over, we're back to square one. And I've seen it happen in Barbados, and I've seen it in other parts of the country. That is, anytime there's a crisis in the region, we run back and talk productivity, and then when it's over, we move back to the things as usual. Not realizing that productivity is basic 101 going forward in driving the economy forward. Remember what I said about profitability earlier? Profitability is underlined by enhancements in productivity. So if you want to be productive, you have to focus on the customer. If you don't focus on the customer, people will go elsewhere. You're producing things, but nobody's buying them, and therefore they're just building up inventory. Maintaining a high quality product. And I'm going back. Where's that? Yeah. Okay. Streamlining production processes. Important. One of the things I found is saying, look at the Jamaica situation, which I'll come to later on, is that a lot of problems occurred in the Jamaican manufacturing thing because of just that. Inadequate production systems. In the plant layout, use of old technology and things of that nature. There was a takeover of the Jamaican economy by the Trinidadians. In the same way, Trinidadians seem to have taken over everything, including Barbados. And one particular company that I was involved in, a new person because one of the persons there was a student of mine, went into that company and just restructured the whole company, the Jamaican company. This is a Trinidadian going to a company. I will not call it in. And they saw productivity improvements through the roof because the systems that they had in place were very archaic. They were not conducive to enhancing productivity. So sometimes a simple streamlining. For example, the people on this side can't see this part as a rearrangement of the room, and they were able to see it. That's what it means by plant layout. And rearranging allows you to do certain things. So that's important. Participative management and employee involvement in decision making, because in many cases people know more about the organization than even the managers themselves. Communication, information, and of course incentive and productivity-based pay becomes important. These are the key elements for enhancing productivity in all organizations, whether it's a public sector one or a thing. We as I said, we have just come out of the establishment of strategic planning university. And what was coming through from my discussions with all colleagues throughout all the 4 campuses was that this part dealing with these 2, communication and information flow and participative management, were coming constantly at us. That is, we in executive management were not communicating. In the same way that ministers don't communicate too often until election time. Well, I know but there are 2 exceptions here, of course. There are 2 exceptions. And since I know both of them well over the years, there are 2 exceptions. So, but certainly communication, information flow is always a critical issue in organizations because that allows you to do things and to respond to crises and issues very earlier than you do in the past. And also, therefore, we are saying then that the implementation of these particular initiatives that I mentioned earlier have a certain impact on various organization performance variables such as the profitability, the market share, reducing absenteeism, because certainly people turn off from coming to a company if they know, well, I mean, in a sense, going there, same old, turnover, and so forth. So in order to boost organization performance and productivity, these particular measures, as I said here, have to take in consideration the culture and needs of the organization. You can't just take a particular measure and put it in a particular company and say, increase. That will not work. You must understand the thing. In the same way, and as I was talking to the minister just now, in the old days with the IMF, for example, they would come down, and I've been in economics long enough to know this. 30 years ago, they would have come and they'd say, well, this is what we want to do. No discussion, no argument, or very little with anybody, even with they would disregard the Minister of Finance. Now I think they've changed around a little bit. And they're willing to listen to local advice and so forth, much more than they did in the past. So they realize that the one thing cannot fit all situations, and you need to modify. So productivity measures, you have now to assess the organizations, and therefore the consultants in here will have a lot of work to do, and then decide, well, based on your needs, this is the particular measure I would suggest to go forward. It could be an incentive payment scheme. It could be just a matter of improving communication. It could be a situation where you need to reallocate your plant and how things are done, as simple as that. So we have a number of measures that can enhance productivity, and the question is, well, do these things really work? And what I've done here is to give you from my own work, empirical work both in Jamaica and Barbados, and I said this idea of increasing productivity started back in the 90s when we had serious problems in the economy. The Jamaica Productivity Center started first, and that shut down and then opened back in recent times. Barbados is still going since 1993. It is still functioning, and many of you might have met some of the people who are doing that. Trinidad has been here, there, can't get off the ground yet. I guess because they feel they have all the oil in the world, that they don't have to worry about these things. But the chickens are coming out to roost. They are seeing some serious problems. So various productivity schemes have been introduced in the region, and therefore the question is, what impact have these particular schemes had on things? So there's a study that I did evaluating the gain change schemes that we had done in Barbados. And what we found from the implementation of those gain change schemes, which tend to be the Rucker and the KPI ones, the sort of goal chain type schemes, we found that they had a significant impact on not only labor productivity, but overall productivity. It had an impact on cost reduction, enhancing the quality of the product, competitiveness, improving labor market relations. So gain change schemes can work. Also a follow-up study that was done since the study that we did by Bannister also for the thing. They updated the study and found that the gain change schemes had again a significant impact on labor and overall productivity. It had enhanced commitment to organizations, improved teamwork, help with management, because here it is, the important thing of these schemes that you have to employ, you have to incorporate the workers in developing these schemes. The important thing about enhancing productivity is that you must have some degree of control over the production of the good. If you don't have any control over it, you therefore can't influence it. So the important thing is to have control, and you must be in a position therefore to say, well, I can do better. I can enhance customer service if I know I can do it. But if it means just pushing a button, that you have no control, what happens after that? You can't increase productivity. So you have to have some degree of control over the output that you produce. And that's important going forward. And that has to do with performance measures. Again, I was able to do a study for the National Bank of Barbados where we look at a performance-based payment scheme that was implied. And again, the same things occur. Improved quality of work, the whole question of the willingness to help managers and supervisors, because these things require cooperation in the firms. In the same way that you have Barbados talking about a social partnership which involves government, the unions, and the private sector, doing the things going forward, companies also need workers and employers working together. There's another case of an incentive scheme, the same thing occurs. Another case of Supercenter in Barbados, a supermarket, a performance-based scheme, and all of these things, as I said, the handout, we can go into that. And then there's another one on human resource practices that were done in a hotel sector. Again, the influence on the importance of those practices on enhancing productivity, improving market share, and so on. And then a major study that I was involved with KPMG what we did is to do an overall assessment of managerial systems that were introduced and also HR systems. And what we found at the end of the day that these managerial systems had a significant impact on, again, productivity, employee motivation, teamwork, cooperation, and customer service. The HR ones did the same thing. They had these HR initiatives that were introduced had an positive impact on productivity, employee morale, and teamwork, and so on. And of course, the gain change schemes, same thing. So the story of all of this is that, certainly from the empirical work that we have done, suggests, therefore, that certainly in the Barbadian context, these productivity employment schemes, productivity enhancing schemes do have an impact on certainly enhancing productivity, but also enhancing the overall environment in which people work. Jamaica, I was involved with some work in Jamaica, and this particular PhD thesis I was the examiner for, and out of Toronto. And again, work systems was done. We found that in terms of Jamaica, the implementation on various work system innovations, HR practices, had a significant impact on business performance, whether it's marketing, sales, productivity, and so forth. And that, again, more of the same. What was particularly interesting is that when I did an overall survey of productivity schemes in Jamaica a couple of years ago, both at the national level and organizational level, we found that a number of things occurred. That the shift to services and growth in the informal sector, that movement, and anytime you move from services and petty services in the informal sector, tend to lower overall productivity in the economy. So if you want to measure national productivity and you have a high level of services and also informal sector, it might be a measurement problem, but certainly it seems to be that these are associated with low productivity areas, and we have therefore to look at it. Again, this is a book that I always recommend people to read. It's a bit dated, but it's probably one of the most famous books in HR in the Caribbean, Why Workers Won't Work. And although a lot applies to the Jamaican context, it says a lot about trust, because it focuses basically on the whole question of trust in organizations. That the poor work management relations and distrust by workers was fundamental to low levels of productivity in the Jamaican companies. And that's why, as I said earlier, the Trinidadians went in and tried to build up trust, enhance your work and employment relations, and that's it. Deficiencies in the education system. We have a situation where, and I'll alert the ministers to this, don't push for universal secondary level education alone. That's fine. That can give you good enrollment rates. It can push you up in the HDR and all that sort of thing. Focus on the output of the education system. We in Barbados have a situation where we have universal secondary level education, meaning you must go to school till you're 16 plus, 17. But what we've seen over the years is that close to 40% of those persons who come out have absolutely no certification whatsoever. And another 10% have very low levels of certification. So if you then convert that to labor market data, you find that a bulk of the people tend to be in what we call elementary occupations, and also in low-level occupation, because that's all they can do. So what you want to do in terms of the education system, as Jamaica is now recognizing with its HEART and TA and so forth, is that we have to focus a lot on skill development in school, in the education system, and not just saying that the numbers of enrollment is up to 100% or gross enrollment being above. Look at what is going on in school, because it's the output of the school system that is much more critical to the productivity of a company or a particular nation than just the number of persons in the school or coming out of the school system alone. So that's a word to the wise. Outdated plant layout, the same points I mentioned earlier. Absence of the clear link between effort and reward, weak social infrastructure, absence of quality standards, high incidence of poverty, crime and violence, dependence and remittances. This is also important, and here the old question, if you have remittances, money coming in, why kill myself to work? I know money coming in the month, and that can do what I want to do, so I can cool out, so to speak. And that was a problem in Jamaica. So we have, therefore, so that's some of the evidence in this quick tour of what I want to say in relation to the Caribbean. In a nutshell, what I'm saying is that there are a number of measures that can enhance productivity. Many of them have worked in organizations in the region, and therefore we need to look at those, how best we can implement those things, not only within the organizations, depending on needs and culture, but also at the national level, how we need to enhance aspects of the nation to be able to deal with some of these issues. So in conclusion, therefore, I just want to say beyond productivity. That is, an interesting study that came out in the United States recently, talked from the Institute of Corporate Productivity, focused on 5 key factors which have the potential to raise productivity of the organization. What are those 5? Effective leadership. And not in the organization, this also applies at the nation. Because if you have a champion at the governmental level, in the private sector, in the trade union movement, this clearly will have things going, right? Establishing a high productivity performance culture. That is saying that we're not interested in this slackness in here. We're interested in high product. We have a purpose going forward. A lot of people look to Singapore, and that's one element. Those 2 elements are very critical to their success over the years. A serious disposition. I mean, I've studied, and I'm quite sure both ministers have studied with persons from Singapore and the Asian. And they don't skylark when they come to work. When they come to work, they come to work. And that's been my experience, certainly studying in both Canada and the United Kingdom. So that's where you want to go. Focus your mind on what you have to do. You can skylark later on. Employee engagement, it becomes important. We have situations where within the region, and studies that I've seen both in university and outside, point to where a lot of employees are just not engaged in their companies. In anything for that matter. They just come to get their salary and they go on with their business, even within the university West Indies. So don't think I'm talking outside. We just did a survey within the university, and the University of West Indies has a very low turnover rate. So if you're looking for a job, come to university. You're going to stay there for life. But the engagement is very low. And the Vice Chancellor and I and the University Registrar have been trying to rationalize, well, why this is so. It's very simple. If you have a cushiony job, and that is not to say that the minister mustn't pay the university the money that is owed. I mean, let me get that clear. But certainly, therefore, we are saying then that you don't have the pressure on you. You get your salary in month come, you have your thing. So I don't have to come and be bothered by all the other things, but you want me to do this and do that, to be engaged and going well beyond the job, because I'm doing my basics. So we need, therefore, the challenge for us, therefore, is to get workers to be mentally and emotionally to invest in their work and feel comfortable and good about their work. Training and development, that goes in HR, critical. And of course, you must have incentive schemes, compensation benefits, and so forth going forward. So what we find, therefore, is that companies have now, and the discussion on productivity has gone certainly beyond just the simple, narrow concept of productivity to one of talking about performance in its broadest concept. Because productivity, as I said, is just the output to input relationship. But there are a number of elements that go into the output. Output has a lot to do with customer service, the quality of the product, how you respond, response rates. Your inputs have a lot to do with your training, your absenteeism, your engagement. So therefore, we want now to say, well, therefore, both the output and input are elements that now go beyond just narrow confined, and you want to extend that whole concept of productivity into a broader realm to call it performance-based management. So you find now that a lot of emphasis being placed on the balanced scorecard, which allows you now to incorporate different elements of organization, whether it's financial, whether it is customer service, whether it's internal operations and employee enhancement. These are important, and the whole question of performance-based pay. So therefore, in an organization, in a dynamic business environment and economic environment where organizations are seeking to outcompete others, there's a highly competitive, we are now into a highly competitive world. Technology is taking over things. Companies are now seeking to either enhance their product quality, they're either trying to be close to their customer, what we call customer intimacy, or they're trying to enhance their operational excellence. And certainly to achieve all of the, and this has nothing to do with just to be a public or private, all of them are doing that. I'm quite sure the minister both ministers will want to keep their costs down. That's important. And you want to provide the same level of service or more services for the amount of money you expend. Because I keep saying to people, when you tell the government to do something, all you're doing is telling the government tax you more. Simple as that. I'm quite sure the minister level would say, well, if you want me to go and build a bridge between here and Bermuda, well, I mean, Barbuda or wherever, all they can do is to tax you because there's no else. The revenue, that is the revenue of government, 99 or close to 99%, 95, let me be generous, 95% of the revenue that governments get is by taxation, including the ministers to them who have to be taxed. So therefore, we are saying that when you tell government go and do this, all you're saying to government, do one or two things. Either tax me more, cut back on something you're doing before, right? Or alternatively reallocate resources around the place. Inevitably, it comes back to be taxing, in most cases, in terms of what. So, if not because the others are always seen to be painful to people. So, in conclusion, therefore, I want to say that organizations, because the nature of how productivity is defined and what we need to do, have therefore to focus more on performance management rather than just the narrow concept of productivity management, and especially in a services-oriented economy like Antigua and Barbuda. And this is where the human resource professionals like yourself here, the 30 plus, and I hope that you now join, those non-30 will come and join the other 30, and have a very viable, vibrant Human Resource Professional Association of Antigua and Barbuda. Because certainly, you as human resource managers, professionals generally, must be seen as important strategic partners in the process of change and development in Antigua and Barbuda, but also in the region. Thank you very much.